My role as science advisor is to be both a supporter and a critic, and you'll hear a little of both today. This is a concept developed 100 years ago, but in fact, I think it's only become relevant currently. And it's become relevant currently because we're in an incredible accelerated transition that very few of us understand fully. As a scientist, as someone who comes from the background of neuroscience and evolutionary biology, I would like to understand how this works. So what I'll try to do today, though I don't have much time to do this, to introduce a few ideas to help you understand why it's relevant today. This is the title of my talk in the abstract. It's posted. I'm not going to read it or show it to you, but I put it up here so if you want to go and chase it down, you may. Because what I want to talk about today is this concept of the noosphere, not as something in the future, but as something that's present today, that's been present for a long time, that we've been a part of without actually paying attention to that fact. Throughout most of my career as a neuroscientist and evolutionary biologist and student of human evolution, I have been fairly critical of this concept of the noosphere. But as I said a moment ago, I've become much more attracted to it, and I'm here today to sort of provide, to some extent, my coming of age and understanding this concept. Somewhere around 1923 or so, three men met in Paris, Pierre Teilhard Deschardin, Edouard Leroy, and Vladimir Vernadsky. And in this discussion, they conceived of this concept of the noosphere. We're not quite sure who came up with it first, who said it first, when it was first published, but it pretty much zeroes in at about 100 years ago today. And as a result, this conference is meant to honor this notion. And just a few words, although most of you know this, the word noosphere, of course, comes from the Greek root nous, or mind, and spheria, or sphere, like the globe. It refers to what can be described as sort of the thinking envelope of our planet, and it's emerged from the biosphere with the evolution of humans. In other words, this is a human concept, and we'll try today to talk about why it is so. Teilhard's view, of course, comes from a fairly deep understanding of both Christianity and his efforts as an evolutionary biologist. In fact, he was one of those involved in the Chinese excavation, what was then called Peking Man, today called the Chukutian Homo habilis specimen. One of the most important specimens in the early study of human evolution. As a result, he tried to put together these ideas of evolution as they were understood in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, a theory that's changed radically even today, with his ideas of Christian purpose and value in the world. Many people look at this view as a sort of science fiction-y or futurist view of the world. I think this is a mistake. Rather than being a futurism, I'm going to argue that the concept of the noosphere characterizes the human condition throughout our evolution, at least ever since we began to communicate symbolically, as with language and with ritual and so on. This distinctively human condition is, however, undergoing some major transitions today. Again, because of a change in the way we communicate. And so it's relevant to bring Teilhard's ideas up to date and bring them into coincidence with modern science. Teilhard's views were based on two core assumptions, and I'll try to make them clear today and then show you how they fit in with modern theories of evolution. Number one, he claimed that evolution is a cosmic tendency with a definite direction. You've heard Ben Kassira talk about this notion of directionality. It was a directional of change towards increased complexity, diversity, and intelligence. But it has a second component to this. He argued that human evolution adds to this the capacity for self-reflection, as he called it, which basically counters this tendency of diversification, of fanning out of adaptations, filling lots of niches, and instead contributes to a tendency for increased interconnection. What he called a sort of a convergence tendency. The second idea is somewhat anathema to a lot of modern theoretical biologists. Think about evolution. But it's beginning to come around in a different form, and I want to talk about that as we move along. I want to begin with a quote, because with respect to the second assumption, there are many theories that are out there to explain what might be what every school child recognizes when we talk about evolution, that in effect, things have become more complex over the last 3.5 billion years. This idea was not characteristic of natural selection. And one of the things that's happened is we've begun to realize that the transitions between these major steps in complexity are a little bit different than what Darwin had actually conceived of. Sometimes they're called major transitions in evolution. This has become a very popular concept in the last 25 years. So I want to begin with a quote from somebody who I think captures one of the essential aspects of this problem. This comes from Plato's discussion in the Phaedrus, where Socrates is commenting about the effects of written language. Why would Socrates say something about written language? He says, if men learn this, it will implant forgetfulness in their minds, and they will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. It's interesting that there's a kind of irony to this comment. There's an irony because we know this. We've read Plato, many of us. We know what Socrates probably thought and explained even before it was written down. So in one respect, Plato is right here. We're all familiar with this with respect to our cell phones, of all the numbers we no longer can remember, because we depend upon this external device. And of course, much of us that are involved in the sciences or the arts and so on know so much about our fields because of what's not in our heads. We know how to get to it, but it's not there. But along with this forgetfulness, giving up something, to be, in a sense, attached or dependent upon this other means, we're capable of doing so much more. The complexity of, for example, the James Webb Space Telescope looking back into the deep history of the cosmos is only possible because we've had this tool. But it's a tool that brings us together so that I can actually talk about what Socrates actually thought about language. How is this relevant to the evolution of biological systems and their complexity? The key is that there's kind of this nested Russian dolls-like nature to the evolution of complexity in the animal and plant world. What we find is that increased hierarchical complexity is the result of smaller organisms getting together to some extent, to form something like colonies where they become codependent on each other. They can't live apart any longer. This higher order integrated unit becomes a new functioning whole because all the smaller parts now need each other and have to work together to accomplish something, but they can accomplish something that they alone could not have accomplished in isolation. So what we see as we go from viruses to bacteria to cells to larger animals and now to social groups like ourselves, we find more and more capacity develops. But this capacity is in part developed because of what's been given up. It's developed because of what we now depend upon collectively. We depend on each other. Interestingly enough, this has got two sides to it, a positive and a negative. In order to be part of a larger whole, you need to sort of give something up. You need to give up your autonomy just a little bit. This is also true in biology, and it's captured by one of the most famous features, that eukaryotic cells, the cells that occupy your body and my body, and most of the plants we know of and fungi, have within them little organelles called mitochondria and chloroplasts. The chloroplasts are what make them green, what make plants green to capture sunlight for energy. But it turns out that these were once free-living bacteria with about 5,000 genes each. But notice that over time, as they've become what we call endosymbionts, that is, symbiotic with a larger organism in which they're now embedded, they've lost most of this capacity, and they've specialized in just a few capacities. As a result, the mitochondria have lost almost 99% of all the original genes that were there. Chloroplasts, about 98%. Simplification is something that goes on in order to be part of a larger, more powerful unit. This is also true for other kinds of endosymbionts. Many of you know that we have bacteria living in our own guts, but of course, this is a very common feature that we now know all over the world in almost all species, complicated species, and insects, for example. So aphids are a good example. They host a critical endosymbiont bacterium that enables them to penetrate into the plant to get to the tubes where the fluids are flowing. They couldn't do this without this bacterium in their gut. But the bacterium as well has lost a lot of its genes, as has the aphid. The aphid has now created a part of its body that supports this. And the bacteria now, with that support, have been able to give up a lot of their autonomy. They can't live without the aphid, and the aphid can't live without them. But as a result, we have a creature that can do much more than either one could have done alone. The question is there something like this that happened in our own past? I think it began, and this is a hypothesis that we have yet to be sure of. I think it began with the use of stone tools. We needed stone tools early on. The first stone tools appeared just a little over 3 million years ago in groups called the Australopithecines. They don't show up to be regular tools that are regularly associated with our ancestors until about 2 million years ago. But for a long period of time, they were being used as, probably most of the time, as butchery tools. And this required sort of cooperation. You had to get together to do this, in part because who are you going to butcher? You're not killing these animals yourselves. But in the open savanna, you go to kill sites and you butcher these animals for food. That requires cooperation. You need to do it together with each other. In fact, somebody needs to protect you from the predators that are out there that actually did the deed while you're getting the food. And then after you get this, you're going to have to share it with everybody involved. A lot of cooperation is necessary. This cooperation requires something. It requires being able to communicate and to organize each other. It needs a means to communicate about the possibilities of what's going to happen afterwards, the possibilities of what could happen, what might happen, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. How do you communicate about something that hasn't happened yet, something that's not here and now, something that's abstract? Well, a number of ways that animals communicate. We mostly describe them as iconic forms of communication and indexical forms of communication. But this kind of communication couldn't be accomplished by using these, what we call non-symbolic forms of communication. Iconic and indexical interpretation processes are grounded by properties in the thing you actually see or experience. And that means that what they'll refer to is something here and now, or something just about to happen, or that just happened. Basically, fairly locked in time and locked in concrete nature. In order to communicate this more complicated set of relationships about promises, about obligations, about trust, about future, about past, about who's doing what, you need a different form of communication. And some point in our past, I think it goes back almost 1.8 million years, we developed another mode of communication, probably beginning in a ritualistic way, maybe using hand signs or gestures and so on, that we have now developed over this time. Mostly in the form of language, but of course in many other forms of symbolic communication. So a form of reference that doesn't require that the sign properties share anything with what they refer to is a critical step. Because this allows you to communicate about things that are not here and now, that are not immediate, that are not like anything you're producing. But as a result, being able to communicate about these things that are not immediately observable, not yet here, might be here, might happen, is a crucial step. The problem is, because the sign vehicles don't help you out, you have to have a collective habit of interpreting things the same way. And the same problem is now here. It's a kind of passing the buck problem back. How is it that we all will share a way of saying the same thing the same way and meaning the same thing? Well, of course, we never quite do, but we get pretty good at it. But what this means, and what we all recognize, is that language is not just in our heads. In fact, it's something that was out there in the social group we were a part of. and that we inherited it. In fact, we can't even think without this. Let me make some comparisons. I'm going to talk about this concept of eusociality. Eusociality refers to colonial species in which most individuals cannot reproduce except within a large cooperative social group. The evolution of eusociality requires the sacrifice of individual reproductive autonomy, to become part of a higher order, codependent kind of superorganism. In fact, the term has been used to talk about insect colonies like hive bees and ant colonies. This is a result of a kind of obligate codependence. They now need each other. They can't do without each other. Notice the analogy to what I've been talking about. Two extreme examples are shown here. On the left, these are worker bulldog ants. And if you look closely, what you'll see is that they're giving birth to eggs. In fact, the workers lay their own eggs and feed the larvae of the queen with their own eggs. Instead of reproducing, they're helping somebody else reproduce. The one on the right are honeypot ants, where the workers instead become effectively containers for food, for honey in this case, to keep the ant colony going. In other words, there's all these specializations and loss of this capacity and this sort of addiction to being a part of the social group. What I want to say is that to some extent, we're a eusocial species as well. Not because we depend on each other for reproduction, though we do in a minor way compared to these animals, but because, in effect, normal brain development is dependent on this kind of immersion in a symbolic culture from our very early life. In fact, if it's not this way, our brains don't develop normally. We can't think the way people normally think. We need to be part of this colony that we're embedded in. So the developing nervous system expects to find symbols in the world, expects to be part of a social group that will help the maturation of the brain and all the things that we can do. Like the social insects, we really can't live outside of this context. So in this respect, we are like obligate endosymbionts within this noosphere. Except we're not within an organism. We're in something that's a collective mental space somehow. We don't think about it that way, but in fact, we are, in this case, symbolically eusocial. And as a result, non-human communication mostly involves what you might call immediate sharing of space, touch, immediate events, and so on. It's shown here with chimpanzees in the top left, bonobos in the right. A little bit of food sharing down here in the bottom left. But notice a difference between human beings when we're sharing food. We're not just in the same place. We're somehow in the same mental space. Or as you see this teacher and students, they're not just in the same space, they're in the same mental space. It's a collective space. Again, a noosphere. I think one thing that's captured really well by M.C. Escher, the artist, is this entanglement we have with each other. We're effectively spending a lot of time simulating what's going on in each other's minds. And in fact, we hold each other responsible for that, whether it's simply morality or love or sympathy or empathy. It's something that's there because of this capacity to represent something that's not immediately present. None of your thoughts are immediately present to me, but as we talk and interact and share ideas, they become involved in us. So I like to compare us in this respect with beavers, because my claim is that once language-like behavior became critical to hominin life, it effectively became an artificial niche to which hominin brains had to adapt. And this is analogous to the way beavers' bodies have adapted to the aquatic niche that beavers produce. But we produce the noosphere, and we've had to adapt to it. In fact, much about our bodies and minds are this way. I've spent a good deal of my career talking about this relationship, how language has reshaped the brain, and how biases of the brain have shaped the way language works. I will spare you the neuroscience here and move on. But just to give a sense that it's not just that we have language out there, it's totally integrated. In fact, I've at one point wrote a piece of a research paper that was called Human Symbolic Nature, precisely because our use of symbols has changed our biological nature radically. So what I want to claim then is that we've been, all of this period of our evolution, been part of a noosphere. We haven't noticed it, we don't pay attention to it, we haven't described it. But that's who we are. Symbolic information cannot be acquired or transmitted genetically, but has to be learned. It has to be learned by being embedded in a social group. And the members all have to share something in common. Nobody invented language. It sort of developed spontaneously in this large social group. But now we can't do without it. We're addicted to being this way. As a result, human minds depend upon being embedded in a social symbolic ecosystem. But also, what this means is that we're also obligate endosymbionts. Endosymbionts in the way I've described it in terms of the little bacteria inside of the guts of aphids. We're inside of the guts of culture, so to speak. And as a result, collectively, we're capable of incredible things. But individually, we have to be part of this. And that means also many of our social and emotional capacities have been maintained in order to maintain the noosphere, because we need it. So we all have changed our emotions, our way we interact because of this. The referential displacement, however, that comes with symbols is important. Remember that because symbols are capable of this kind of communication of the abstract, of the not here and now, of the possible, of the impossible, it means that not only are we dependent upon each other, but the way we communicate can run away from the grounded truth of the world. Our ideas, our beliefs, our ideologies, our self-stories can be, in some sense, decoupled from the world. And this gets us in trouble often. So the idea is that we're a eusocial species, but we're now a symbolically eusocial species. We need each other. Our cognition is not just in our heads. Although we're still competing and arguing and sharing ideas, this is something that we're just a part of. We're swimming in it. It's not separate from us, and we're not separate from it. This tendency to recruit extrinsic physical and cognitive supports is a defining feature of our species. It's been so since we were using stone tools. And we've recruited this way of communication to augment our mental capacities. It aids in our calculations. We use an abacus or a computer or whatever. We immediately jump to it. We also have a predisposition to offload whenever we need to. I call this a sort of a least work principle in human evolution. But it's a least work principle, as you saw, even in the development of eukaryotic cells and so on. There's a least work principle at work in evolution, but that least work principle actually is what brings things together, makes them codependent. So we could call this process also the symbolosphere. It's an idea that was suggested by a man named John Schumann in UCLA, actually following some of my own work, that we're living in a world of symbols. But of course, as we've expanded and expanded and expanded, how we do this is no longer just symbols. But the symbolic communication system is what drove this process. So the vast majority of these innovations have arisen, unfortunately, or fortunately, perhaps for us, in just the past century. And information-based communication, electronic-based communication, has only been around for a few decades. But as a result, our brains, our minds, because of this least work principle, are already predisposed to sort of take advantage of it. So it's not a surprise that when these new capacities become available, we're immediately integrated into it. It's easy for us. It's trivial. But remember, these are devices. These are not other minds. These are processes that work differently than we do. We've become now integrated also with our tools, these unique tools. We're also endosymbionts in that world. And that world is not necessarily a world of human thought. Although it's created by human thought, it has different predispositions, different tendencies, and so on. So what I want to claim is that we're rapidly expanding this interpenetration of our minds by virtue of this. Though we have less and less personal contact, though I'm happy to see so many of you here in person, as we have these devices, we're also in contact with hundreds of thousands of people around the world, oftentimes even more if we're in social media and we just throw our information out there. We can talk about ideas like this across the world as we're doing today, and simultaneously with huge numbers of people. But because of this, we're becoming a little more dependent upon something that we don't fully understand yet, and that may be a challenge. So although human mentality has always been dependent upon and subordinate to a larger distributed form of mentality, the balance has begun to shift. An increasing fraction of what once was produced by neural activity is now performed electronically. These extended cognitive tools are no longer just cognitive supports like writing, because to some extent they've become the tail that's wagging the dog. Although our long evolution as a symbolic species has made us necessarily incomplete unless we're assimilated into this larger shared symbolic niche, these recent enhancements to this niche have radically shifted the balance from its biological and subjective aspect to a more electronic and algorithmic aspect. The question is, how will this affect us? How will this affect the noosphere? What kind of noosphere can we imagine? As I said before, we have never left the noosphere. We're still in it, but it's changing radically around us. So the challenge of this group, of course, is going to be to figure out what's actually at work. How does it work? We scientists have an obligation to understand this, to struggle to present lots of alternatives, lots of hypotheses about how it works, and test them as best we can, because this is happening very, very fast. So the question is not whether a noosphere will evolve in the human future. We've been a noospheric species for as long as we have been adapted to life in a symbolic niche. The question is what sort of noosphere is developing under the influence of these rapidly accelerating advances in communication. Again, remember Plato. We are lost some autonomy in order to be part of this. But the question is, what is it we're going to be part of? Are we going to be like social insects? Are we going to be like the mitochondria that have lost 99% of their autonomy? Or are we going to be something else? To understand the logic of this process is to understand our future. Without struggling to understand it, it won't be the future that Teilhard envisioned. Thank you very much.
Hey, Terry, great presentation. I'm Kevin Kelly, Wired. You had 2 points, which was that there was a direction to evolution and that it was converging, and that the first one was accepted. Actually, the first one's, even that's controversial, but the second one of convergence, you didn't really get to that in your talk. What can you say anything about the evidence that this is converging in evolution rather than just continuing to radiate?
So the key here is that this convergence tends not to be convergence across all of evolutionary biology. Most of the world is still in this process of divergence into distinctive niches with distinctive adaptations. In those cases that I talked about, endosymbiosis, for example, those are within just a few species or sometimes just within one species. In the case we're talking about here, Teilhard was, of course, only speaking of us. only speaking of the human species, that to some extent, although biologically we may still be diverging and intermixing in complicated ways, his suggestion and my suggestion is that because of this communication medium that we're living with, that's what's converging. We're all carrying many similar ideas, and that will increase over time. That's the convergence. But what we see in each of these major transitions is a local convergence that has produced the complexity that we see in multicelled organisms, in social insects, and so on. So I didn't spend a lot of time on that just because it's a very complicated idea, but the basic idea is that within organisms, and probably the driver, what we call major transitions, oftentimes has to do with that convergence and loss of autonomy of separate parts.
Thank you, Terry. Great to meet you in person. Peter Whitehouse, intergenerational educator. I attended the October 20th meeting virtually of the American Teilhard Association, which was done conjointly with the French Teilhard Association, celebrating the 100th anniversary as well. And it focused on Teilhard Mass, his role as a priest, his family was there, or family members. And in my work with transdisciplinary societies, big history societies, there's this tension between where the word spirit comes into the conversation with science. So maybe your neuroscientific anthropological perspectives can project some history forward of the relationship between science and spirit. Thank you.
Not sure I have the expertise to answer that. But what I would say is that, of course, Teilhard is talking about something that we might call the human spirit. This is something that may be a little bit like this sort of shared spirit that in some sects is called the Holy Ghost, some spirituality that's shared among us, or as Carl Jung called it, the collective unconscious. To some extent, probably we're talking about something closer to that. I certainly am unable to sort of speak to the spiritual side of Teilhard's work. It's not my expertise. But I do think that there's no necessary contradiction between what I've been talking about and what we might call the spiritual development of human beings. For Teilhard, this was, of course, a spiritual developmental process, that the human spirit writ large is expanding and interpenetrating and becoming more integrated into one.
Hi, Margot Wixom. I'm an artist and illustrator. I'm curious about, in the original theories were mostly about biology, et cetera, and even in your slides, much of it relies on the artistic expression, which is very uniquely different than the biological the development. It's something very uniquely happens there, and how deeply it is influenced from early cave art, early, indigenous art that is scribing symbolic language. And even today, when we hold that thing in our hand of social media, it is visually stimulating, where that visual component becomes as important as the biological, geological piece. I'd like you to just comment on that.
It's an excellent question. And I want to be clear that when I talk about symbols, I'm not just talking about language, but I'm actually talking about a way of interpreting the world. I oftentimes describe us as symbolic savants. When we look at anything in the world, we try to figure out, well, what does that mean? We get surprised by coincidences, and we're looking for some underlying logic that holds it together. One of my favorite books published here in the Berkeley area is called Why Cats Paint, a Theory of Feline Aesthetics. And on the cover of it is a cat, looks like scratching away with colored paints, presumably painting the picture of a bird that's sitting in front of it. My envisioning of that is that the cat has its legs trapped to the ground and is scratching to get to the prey. But the point that they make here with a sort of tongue-in-cheek way is how unique our artistic capacities are. Where effectively we look through things for the meaning. This is not something that other species do. But with symbolic communication, we have no choice. Because what's on the surface is not what it's about. And as a result, you always have to look past it. I think this is, in a sense, a tendency that's built into the human cognitive capacity and emotional capacity. We look through things to find their meaning, to find their value. We have a predisposition to do that because if we didn't, we would be poor symbol users. But because of that, I think this is what gives us this exciting capacity to look at just forms and see through them to their meaning, possibly. Some of the best cartoons capture this sort of contradictions of meaning that really get us to think. But I also think this is critical also for one way we think about the world. Since Plato's time, since Descartes, we've often thought about the world as having a sort of, quote, spiritual plane and a mundane physical plane. I think this is in part because when we look at what's right there in front of us, if we think of it as a symbol, as symbolizing something, we want to know what's behind it, what generated it. That's part of our essence, that we think that way. Now, whether the world is organized that way or not is up for somebody else to explain. But I think that we have this incredible tendency to fall in love with artwork, with just the display of colors or shapes, precisely because of this.
Hello, I'm Raphaël Yogi. I'm a professor des universités in philosophy and sociology in France and the scientific director of the new Institute for Advanced Studies in Morocco that we are about to build. I was wondering, because when I was listening to you, that when we think about Teilhard de Chardin, that he was hardly discredited, he was discredited very strongly by evolutionary biologists like yourself and other people, because in a way his position, his research were supposed to not be compatible with Darwinian science. But when I'm listening to you, and when I reread The Descent of Man by Darwin, where actually he pointed out this idea that what makes the difference with human beings, it's actually solidarity, a kind of solidarity, and at the same time, a kind of autonomy with solidarity. And I'm wondering if it is really not compatible with the thought or Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, that in a way, I'm wondering if it's people that were nihilistic people that interpreted Darwin in a certain way and discredited Teilhard de Chardin, while in fact, we could read Darwin through the eye of Teilhard de Chardin, the other way around. What do you think about that?
Very interesting problem. I do think because of the renewed interest in what I call major transitions in evolution, and hopefully there'll be others in the group who'll talk about this idea, that people are rethinking some aspects of Darwinian theory. And it's not that Darwin is wrong, it's that it's not complete. There are many more ways to think about the problem, in part because Darwin assumed that variation could come from any source. One of the interesting questions is that we've been struggling with ever since Darwin is, how is it possible that a very, very complex system, like an organism, can have random changes in its parts that work? It's a remarkable feature. We can't do that with any things we build, of course. They don't have that kind of robustness. And there's lots of attempts to try to deal with that. And many of them now are being answered at the level of genomics and so on. Stuff that, of course, Teilhard and certainly not Darwin could have known anything about. And I think what we see here is, in fact, we're still in the middle of this evolutionary revolution, understanding how this process works. Teilhard's views, I think, would have been a challenge for Darwin. Teilhard developed his views at a time when progress in evolution was a major theory, in which today's sort of anti-progressive evolutionary theory is somewhat out of phase with. But at the time he was writing, progress was a major issue. There were major people writing about progress in evolution, and that, of course, drove his thinking and was compatible with his religious perspective as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry.